Welcome, everyone, to a special edition of Mongols. I'm Mike. Joining me for this one is the founder of Goals, which is an awesome company focused on helping to grow the business side of women's sports. She's been spending some time with our friends in the Hounds front office, and so we thought it would be great to pick her brain a bit. It's Caroline Fitzgerald. Caroline, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for covering women's sports. We love this.
We absolutely love it as well. We've been pining for a women's team for probably 3 or 4 years now, and so the word that the Hounds are finally getting a women's program and that there's hope that it's going to continue to expand and grow from there is just it's amazing. We can't wait. I was excited to talk to you because it was announced that Goals is working with the Hounds to develop pieces of that W program. Can you tell us a little bit about Goals and the type of work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Goals is a women's sports focused media company and a consultancy. We're based here in Pittsburgh. I started this organization 4 years ago, but I've been fully in business for 3 years doing this. When I had the idea to start Goals, it started as a podcast. So, very similar to the work at Mon Goals. But it started as a podcast because I love listening to podcasts and I really wanted to listen to one about the business side of women's sports. And I couldn't find one. And this is in 2020. And I thought that was a little, quite frankly, ridiculous that there wasn't a
Yeah.
podcast that talked about the business of women's sports. So it kind of became my side hobby, if you will, while I was working full time. At the time, I was the senior vice president of sponsorships at the Dick's Sporting Goods Pittsburgh Marathon and P3R. So very familiar with working in sports, love following what's happening in the sports industry. And I just became really, really entrenched in what was going on with women's sports at the time that I had this idea for the podcast. So everything kind of spiraled from there, if you will. And after podcasting for about a year and creating content, under the brand of Goals about the economic and social value that comes along with investing in women's sports, decided to go fully into business. So, like I said, we do media work. So, we still have our podcast. It's the business case for women's sports. It's presented by Ally Financial. We cover the biggest stories on the business side of women's sports, like I said, have been for 4 years. We have our social channels where we, again, put out content to demonstrate the social and economic value of investing in women's sports. And then we also work with a variety of organizations on their efforts to get into the business of women's sports or work on the growth of their business if they're already in women's sports. So, some examples: the Riverhounds, getting to work with the team on the launch of the USLW team coming, which is so exciting. We've worked with a variety of women's sports teams and leagues and their sponsorship work. We've worked locally with the Pittsburgh Passion women's tackle football team. We've worked with the Pittsburgh Penguins on some of their women's hockey initiatives. So it's just been such a fun ride to work across the country for a long time. And for a long time since we've been in business, the last 2 years before now, most of our work has been done outside of Pittsburgh. So it's really excited to now get to do some of this work at home in my backyard.
Oh, for sure. You mentioned sort of being able to tell lots of different stories through your podcast and things like that. Is there a particular story that stands out in your mind as one that you did and you just were like, wow, like that was really cool or it was really impactful?
I always talk about my very first podcast episode because it was just such a special conversation. The first episode was the story of the WNBA's Orange Hoodie, which is a piece of merchandise that went absolutely viral after it was seeded into the hands of lots of athletes, lots of celebrities. And it's such a special campaign because, like a lot of things in women's sports, they had $0 of a marketing budget and they just made an entire movement out of this piece of merchandise. A woman named Eb Jones is the person behind the campaign that made it happen. And Eb came on the podcast and told the story. And no one had ever asked Eb to tell the story of how it all came to be before I had reached out through Twitter and said, "Does anybody know who's responsible for the Orange Hoodie?" And everyone said, "You need to talk to Eb. You need to talk to Eb." And Eb was so willing to take a chance on a new podcaster like me and come on and share the story. And it's to date our highest. It's still the most listened to episode that we have. It's just so incredible what she was able to do. So that's something that's really stuck out. I think it really demonstrates the power of the women's sports movement, how contagious this can be. And oftentimes we have to do it with no resources. So I love that story, and it's one that I'll cherish forever.
That's fantastic. And it is infectious, like for sure. You mentioned, how one of the things that you do is you sort of help try to find sponsorships and things for different women's programs and events. Do you find that companies are more or less inclined to get involved as they would be with a men's program?
Mike, definitely less inclined, and that's what the data shows. I
Mhm.
can say that personally from the work that I've done, and also I keep a really strong pulse on what's happening in the business side of women's sports, and often that means following what's happening in the sponsorship landscape. So the two stats that we know today is that less than 1% of global sports sponsorship dollars go to women's sports. So that
Ooh.
means 99% of sponsorship dollars are going to men's sports. And a new stat just came out the other day that only 6% of Fortune 500 companies are sponsoring professional women's sports. So, by the numbers, objectively, it's much harder to get sponsorship dollars into women's sports. And it's certainly changing, Mike. We are seeing new brands step up. We're seeing incredible brands stepping up in a big way to try to almost make up for those gaps that we're seeing across the market. But it's challenging. And I think that's probably for a lot of reasons. I think there's, some outdated ideas out there that you can't get the same return on investment with your sponsorships with women's sports. You're not going to reach the same amount of people, or they're not going to be as engaged fans. But actually, we have a lot of data to debunk all of those antiquated ideas. So I think it's the work, a lot of the work that we do here at Goals, most of it is around showing the business value that comes with investing in women's sports, the power of women's sports fans, the reach and impact of women's sports, the return on your investment that you can get from sponsoring women's sports. So things are changing. It's slowly but surely. But I am really optimistic that things are going to continue to change, and that they might pick up and change a little bit faster here soon.
That's awesome. Like you said, the data is there in terms of showing that it does make an impact. It'll just be interesting. Hopefully, it's not too much of a grind and take too long to sort of swing the pendulum so that it is more equal for certain. Because it's only right. You've been working with the Hounds for a little bit. Obviously, we think that there is, there's obviously a large appetite for women's soccer. You have the U.S. Women's National Team that is always a huge draw. We know that the Hounds Academy, the women's side, is always cranking out players and setting the national team and college and things like that. Based on the conversations you've had, I don't know how much you've sort of looked around the region. Do you have a sense of sort of the potential for the women's soccer side to succeed in Pittsburgh?
Oh, I am just so optimistic about how it can perform here. I think it's an absolute no-brainer. I'm so excited for the Riverhounds organization that they are embarking on this. I think they have laid all the necessary infrastructure over the last decade and beyond to ensure the success of this organization. So I think on one hand, like, yeah, the Riverhounds have done an amazing job, and this is just the natural next step for the academy and for the organization. But when you zoom out and you look more regionally, I think Pittsburgh is ready for more women's sports. We're seeing attendance at the Pittsburgh Passion Games sold out when they have their home games in the football season. We've seen examples, like you mentioned, the U.S. Women's National Team coming to Pittsburgh and filling up Heinz Field. It was Heinz Field at the time.
Yeah.
And we saw this last winter, the Penguins hosted a neutral site PWHL hockey game between Montreal and I can't even Connecticut. So two teams not even near Pittsburgh, and it was the largest attended women's hockey game in the history of our city. So I
Wow.
just think in general, sports fans are becoming more interested in women's sports, and there's more women's sports fans popping up. And I think that's also attributed to the rich culture, the amount of girls that we have playing sports in this region. We have such a strong community of youth sports. And so more girls have been playing sports than ever before across the country. And that's very true here in Pittsburgh. And I think those girls who play sports are ready to see more opportunities for themselves and ready to see more people that look like them competing at the highest level in sport.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. I think back to anecdotally, I remember when I was in high school, we didn't have a girls' team. And so literally there were so many girls that had grown up playing that they were like, fine, we're just going to take over the guys' team until the point that the school took notice and was like, we should give them a program. And so like that was the start of that. And now I think of all of those women that I've grown up with that, passionate about the game. And it feels like it's this almost generational shift. Do you see any sort of generational differences in the demographics of people that support women's sports? Is it typically sort of younger or is it across the board?
100%. There's two really interesting stats that I like to talk about when it comes to women's sports fandom. So I think there is this idea out there that the only people that can like women's sports are women and specifically little girls. There's a lot of
Mm,
like looking up to role models, and that's absolutely true. I don't want to say like that's not a good thing or that's not true because it is, but the data shows that men actually are in numbers are women sports fans, they outpace women when it comes to their fandom in women's sports. So men are huge
interesting.
fans of women's sports. And then additionally, women's sports fans are skewing much younger. So women's sports are resonating with Generation C at much higher rates than traditional men's sports. Soccer's a
Wow.
little bit different. When I say traditional, I'm looking at the big four. Looking at football, hockey, or big three, big three, big four. I messed that up, but you know what I mean. Hockey,
Yeah.
football. No, big four: basketball and baseball. That's what I'm thinking of. Soccer's a little bit different, but in general, Gen Z is really resonating, or women's sports are really resonating with Gen Z because they like to see diversity when they're watching any entertainment product, sports included. And they also, it resonates with them to see women. Like Gen Z doesn't accept that women wouldn't have every opportunity that men have. So it just makes a lot of sense that they would get on board with the product of women's sports. So those are two things that I find really interesting. Men really enjoying women's sports, and Generation C really, really tuning in as well.
That's awesome. I remember seeing a stat somewhere that there was a women's league that was massive. I think it was in Europe until it was sort of shut down and then they just replaced it with a men's league. But the popularity was just through the roof, men and women across the board. And so it just feels like there needs to be more opportunity and there needs to be more and equal exposure. I think that's the other big thing is what is chosen to be broadcast and shared with people. That's what people are going to consume. And so you kind of have to fight that battle at that level as well. Um, I'm curious. So you're working with the Hounds. Let's say that we're a year or two away from now. What do you constitute as a success of goals, sort of working with the Hounds, and now there's the women's team and it's established.
I mean, our success is their success. We just want to make sure that the team gets off the ground, they bring fans in, the players are having a great experience. I think it's like how you would measure success with any professional sports team or any sports team. It's just that all stakeholders involved are enjoying what is being put forth. And, I think it's just such a special move to have more women's sports available in Pittsburgh. I want to see everybody coming across the river to watch the women's team and seeing that it's a great product on the field,
Hmm.
and regardless of gender, sports are sports. So I'm just really excited to see Pittsburgh come out and cheer for this team. See people come in. It's not necessarily easy to watch women's sports in every city. Not every team has a team here. So I
Right.
could definitely see a scenario where people travel into Pittsburgh to come and watch this team, come enjoy our city. It's just another great reason why people should be coming to check out everything that Pittsburgh has to offer. So I'm excited. I'm so optimistic and so excited about this team. I think it's something that we've been ready for, and Pittsburgh has been craving for a long time, especially the sports community, and I just can't wait to see it flourish.
Oh, I think it's going to be a massive asset for the city, for fans, for the community, for everything. I've been talking to similar people who do podcasts in other cities that have women's programs, and they just rave about how the fans just sort of latch onto it and just becomes such a core part of who they are. And the women's programs developing rivalries with other ones, and it's all that people are talking about. And I just cannot wait for that to happen here in Pittsburgh. I think it's going to be just incredible. Caroline, I know you've got to get out of here. I want to be respectful of your time. You mentioned your podcast. Tell everybody once again where they can find your podcast, where they can find more out about you and all of that and what you got going on with goals.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to put a shameless plug in. So you love women's sports and you consider yourself like a dedicated women's sports fan, then you would love our content and goals. So please follow us across all social media. We're at goals_sports_. So if you type in goals women's sports, you can find us on every social platform. And then the podcast is available everywhere you listen to podcasts. We're the business case for women's sports. We interview leaders from across the women's sports industry. So not just soccer, not just football, all sports, talking about what's happening and what we need to do to close some of the gender gaps that still exist on the business side of sports. So check us out. And then we're also around Pittsburgh doing things. So we pop up at various women's sports events around the region. So we hope to get to meet everybody in person at some point.
Fantastic. Caroline, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for all that you do. This is just super exciting. Really, really glad I was able to talk to you. It sounds like you're onto something really special. Just can't wait to see what becomes the women's program with you and goals by their side. So thanks again.
Mike, thank you. And thank you again for lifting up women's sports. Truly, the media coverage is so important. And you using the platform, Mongols highlighting this is just really special. So thanks for having me.